that is the moment that most people give up. They have a dream. They don't yet have the skills to execute that dream. That is so frustrating that most people, I think, abandon it. And for the people in this book, it was the perseverance through that frustration that enabled them eventually to be so accomplished.
Eli and I are students of the creative process, and so is Adam Moss, author of The Work of Art, How Something Comes from Nothing. Formerly the editor-in-chief of New York Magazine, these days Moss is on a quest in his studio to understand painting, and through it, the mysteries of the act of creation. We talk with Adam about the red threads that run through such varied creative expressions, finding the right creative partners, how to feed creativity, and how his own work has been influenced by his investigation into how creativity unfolds.
Questions about why people create and the diversity of process across mediums led Adam to write his book, which features interviews with a host of inspiring folks. Kara Walker, Tony Kushner, Sofia Coppola, Stephen Sondheim, Barbara Kruger, Ira Glass, Samin Nosrat, Marc Jacobs, David Simon, and many more share their approach to the work they do in the book. This is Design Better, where we explore creativity at the intersection of design and technology. I'm Eli Woolery.
And I'm Aaron Walter. You can get ad-free episodes, bonus content, discounted workshops, and access to our monthly AMAs with big names in design and tech by becoming a Design Better Premium subscriber. It's also the best way to support the show. Visit designbetterpodcast.com/subscribe to learn more. We'll return to the conversation after this quick break. If you're like me and Eli, you know how tough it can be to build a career around your creative passions. That's what we're doing every day, and it's not easy. That's why I want to tell you about Adobe's In the Making podcast. Hosted by Teresa Au, this show digs into the ups and downs of being part of the creator economy with stories from people who've been through it. Whether you're just starting out or looking to grow your creative business, In the Making has something for you. Stick around for more details later in the show, and be sure and subscribe on your favorite podcast player to In the Making from Adobe. And now, back to the show. Adam Moss, welcome to Design Better.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Eli and I have been enjoying your book, The Work of Art, How Something Comes from Nothing. And we were just saying before we hit the record button that it's kind of a sweet spot of our own curiosity of what is creativity? Where does it come from? What's that process like? And it's particularly interesting because your book covers so much ground. There are artists that we might see in the Whitney or Guggenheim, and there are chefs like Samin Nosrat, directors, all sorts of different types of disciplines represented. Before we dive into what you learned, maybe you could just start us off like in the spirit of your book. Where did this book come from? How did you find the kernel of this idea?
So I was a magazine editor for all of my life. My last magazine, Jaunt, was New York Magazine, where I was for 15 years. And that was both the print aspect of the magazine and then starting a whole constellation of digital publications. And then I quit because I wanted to see what else I could do. And I really had a kind of secret hope that I could be a painter, which is something that I had started to dabble in during my last years at the magazine and really enjoyed. And as soon as I quit and started to do it with a certain amount of purpose, it all started to go south for me very quickly. And I just was very frustrated by my own mediocrity. I began to wonder why, and also to wonder how it is that artists who are successful at this pursuit did it, how they thought, particularly what their mind went through as they made a work. And I also had a kind of theory from my life as a journalist was that, perhaps all creative enterprises had certain things in common. So I began to think of a whole range of people that I would talk to answer the question how they think. So I would talk to visual artists, I would talk to novelists and poets and architects and television makers and joke makers and sandcastle makers, all of which are in the book. And basically, I just went on this kind of search, kind of likened it to the children's book, Are You My Mother, where I wanted to talk to artists about how they made something, what went through their mind as they made something. And so I started to have these conversations and then match the conversations. This was an important part of my own thought process, match the conversations with artifacts of their making. So doodles and outlines and sketches, because I love them principally, and we can talk about why later if you want, but also because they were kind of authentic blueprints of their minds as they went about making the work. So that was what I did. I started to talk to people. I started to collect artifacts. My basic theory was that I would get an answer to this question most authentically and most also dramatically, vividly, if we concentrated on one work and we took the one work from its inception through all of its stumbles and failures through to the triumphant finish. And that's what the book is. It's kind of one happy ending after another, but it's a story of struggle.
Do you see creativity as a spiritual act?
Well, it depends on how you define spiritual. I see it as a mystical act in a sense. And I think that there's a lot of unknown in it, even after writing the book where I tried as desperately hard as I could to purge the whole thing of the unknown. I wanted to know. Nevertheless, I was humbled by the fact that there is something you just can't understand about where something comes from. My own feeling about it is that it comes more from the subconscious and from the mind and all that. But there are several people I talked to for the book that thought of it in conventional spiritual terms, which is that it came from some otherworldly or godly aspect. I think basically it's the same thing. It's this unknowable place, wherever you decide it comes from, that provides the raw material for the work you're making. My book was very much centered on what came after that. That is, okay, you have this thing that the imagination has spewed out, but then what do you do with it? And how do you judge it? And then how do you shape it? How do you create a strategy toward making it something? It's kind of what the book was about.
Maybe we could dive a little deeper into that. So there's the subconscious aspect. And from the folks that you talk to, it seems like many people have a very difficult time articulating what's happening there, not surprisingly, because it's happening in your subconscious. How did you take that leap from that part of the creative act to things that are more concrete, the beginnings of inspiration, the sketches, things like that?
I mean, I sort of thought of it, what I was doing is not unlike conducting creative shrink sessions. So it's kind of the same thing where you put them on the couch and you talk to them for long enough that they begin to piece together this thing that has emerged. And then I would show them the artifacts that they themselves showed me and use it as a prompt to help them remember. And then I was extremely rigorous, almost tedious, the extent to which I kept going back to people and saying, and then what, and then what, and then what, so that they could recall the stages, and not just the practical stages, but also in many ways the psychological stages. So how are you feeling then? I was really trying to understand how one gets through failure, because failure was such a big part of what everyone was talking about. They tried something and it didn't work. I found that incredibly reassuring, honestly. But it was also clear that what made them successful is that they had found a way to work their way through failure.
There's a number of spots in the book, a few examples about feeling like the creative process and the output of that work, that it's like channeled through the person. And the person almost feels like a conduit, a vessel, like they were the instrument, but they look at it objectively, separately. I've heard Bob Dylan say the same thing. There was a great interview with him where he's like, asked, well, why don't you write those great songs anymore? And he's like, I don't know how to do it. Back then in the 50s, like they just came through me and I don't know how to do it. I find that fascinating to be a participant and also a spectator simultaneously.
Yeah. One of the things to me, it was so interesting and startling in the book, which is many of these artists were like basically two people. There was a kind of split personality. There's a chapter on Tony Kushner in which he talks about the act of making as picking up breadcrumbs. almost like a fairy tale. And yeah, there was the person who laid down the breadcrumbs and then the other person who picked them up. They were kind of split that way. The interesting thing to me was, not just that they were unable to recall it, but that they really felt that they had blacked out. There was a kind of almost anesthesia aspect when they got hit with whatever you call the creative turnkey. But then the interesting and the difficult part is what you do with it, and why Bob Dylan was able to write songs. And he wrote songs very, very fast. I have a page of Blowing in the Wind in the book, which he says he wrote in a half an hour. But he's able to do that, of course, because of a lifetime of accumulating knowledge and experience and habits and structure. This sort of acquisition of skill is in my view, very underappreciated part of creativity. People don't really want to talk about it because it seems undemocratic. But all that which prepares you becomes essential, and it's very difficult to make art without it. That's why a lot of these people that I talk to just, started early. They started early, they had encouragement, they had teachers and mentors. They got stuff in their bones. It's just like an athlete.
That's a good segue to one of the subjects in your book is Sofia Coppola. Obviously, her father was probably a huge influence and mentor to her. One of the stories I thought that was interesting as far as an example of having a creative challenge and working through it and kind of these happy accidents that happen sometimes was that towards the end of her film Lost in Translation, there's a very touching scene that stood out to me even before I read it back again in your book, was where Bill Murray whispers something to her and it's inaudible to us in the audience. And it turned out that she actually had planned to go back and dub over that later with something. She just hadn't figured out what, but she's just decided, let's move forward, let's make the scene happen, and then we'll figure it out. And then it turned out that not hearing it was actually much better than anything they could have written. And so, yeah, maybe talk about that example or other examples of these kind of happy accidents that just happen through the process.
Well, I mean, happy accidents, happens really kind of everywhere. The key seemed to be you created a means by which an accident could happen. And then you had the ability to recognize what worked in that accident. And then in particular, the Sofia Coppola story, it's one of the things that apparently Italian directors, I think she said, do, is that they put something down to get through it. It was the last scene in the movie when Bill Murray was saying goodbye to Sofia Coppola, and she couldn't figure out how to render that goodbye in a way that didn't sound saccharine or corny. She just couldn't solve the problem. And as I understand it, she had every intention of going back and dubbing that thing in. And then when she saw the dailies, I guess, and saw how effective it was to allow the audience to make their own assumption, guess, to participate, that she kept withholding. I mean, withholding is actually a fantastic tool in art, is when you pull back and you allow the viewer or the reader or the listener to participate in the work by filling it in. So that's what she did there. The book is just full of accidents. I mean, one fantastic example for me is the artist Amy Silman, who was painting this painting, which she eventually called Miss Gleason. And she gave me, in the book, she gave me 32 iterations of what this painting was on its way to being. And they're crazy. They're like wildly different from one another. And several of them are beautiful, but they were not satisfying enough to her. And also the process of making is so central to what she's doing, that she allows herself to press forward, waiting for the accident to strike. It's just an example of accident, save this part, accident, save that part, stumbling her way toward what turned out to be a beautiful painting.
I think that touches on one of the most important parts of the creative process, is being open to the unknown, which we talked to John Cleese and he said, so many people want certainty in the world. In reality, it's just an illusion. We don't really have certainty about almost anything. Can you talk a little bit about that? How artists think about certainty or have an openness that they can cultivate, or maybe they're just kind of born seeing that openness differently?
Well, I do think that there is a kind of characterological aspect to artists, and they do tend to be people who are more comfortable with uncertainty, ambiguity, exploration. Some people are like that, and other people are a little bit more controlled in their thinking. And those who are going to be successful allow themselves to do it. But it's very weird because, on the one hand, you have to be uncontrolled in allowing whatever it is we're talking about to burble up. On the other hand, you have to be very controlled in some ways to execute the work. That there is a kind of rigor that is crucial to the making of art. And the weird thing about successful artists is the way that they can just bop back and forth between these two states, this open state and this closed state. It is remarkable and impressive.
A minute ago, we were talking about mentors, and on your chapter with Samin Nosrat, the chef and author, it sounds like she found both a good mentor and Michael Pollan, the writer who helped her with her writing, but also the right creative partner, her illustrator, Wendy McNaughton, because it seems like things kind of turned around when she had the proposal and pitched it together with the illustration. So maybe talk a little bit about either that mentor or partner side of things.
Well, I think both things happen, and they both happen both by accident and also by Samin's ingenuity in knowing what would work for her, which is somewhat unconscious. I mean, Samin has a very open personality. She admired Michael Pollan. We'll just start with that one. She admired Michael Pollan, and he had come into a restaurant where she was working, and she saw his name on the reservation list. She knew that he was teaching a class. She wanted to be a journalist, sort of. She also wanted to be a chef. She wanted to be a writer. She wanted to be a poet. But she was interested in writing, and she knew that Michael Pollan was teaching a course at Berkeley, and she wasn't enrolled in the class. And she basically talked her way in to this class with a kind of supernatural drive. I mean, she was determined to get into this class, and she kind of prodded and talked her way into the class, recognizing, I guess, somewhat that somehow that Michael would be a mentor for her. And then, of course, when she was in the class, he was. And then when she heard that Michael's next book was going to be about cooking, she recognized that Michael would need himself a mentor. So she put herself in a position to be his mentor, helping him through this book. And then he helped her again as she was looking to sell the book out in the world. And it was that kind of back and forth and back and forth and back and forth that enabled Samin to feel confident that she had an idea worth doing. And in her magnificent book, Michael recognized immediately and said, you have a book in you. This is your book, when she talked to him about it. Yeah, so that's what happened with that. And then Wendy McNaughton, she loved the illustrations that Wendy was doing for, I guess, some alternative newspaper, I think, or something like that. She went after her. There's a great email in the that I published in the book of her to Wendy, kind of trying to not beg so much as seduce her into being a partner for the book. And, Samin recognized that the way that Wendy was expressing herself visually in her work was a kissing cousin to the way that Samin thought and at that point was writing. So yeah, I think that's a really perfect illustration of the way that partnership, mentorship can work.
You talk a lot in the book about inspiration, or you ask that question. It seems that was a frequent question in each of the interviews. And it's one that we hear a lot, like, what inspires you? It seems sort of nebulous, but I think what we're searching for is like, what's the seed? How does this thing germinate, and where does it get started? Because we want to go find the seeds for ourselves and discover how to grow this stuff. What did you learn about inspiration, and like what it is, what we mean by inspiration, and then how people use it differently?
Well, I think for one thing, it's just a thing that occurs to you, just a thing that flies into your head. And the truth is that we all have that. We all are inspired all the time. We see a leaf and it provokes an idea, but the idea just, we throw it away. We don't recognize it for what it is. We're all inspired. We all dream. We all imagine. The difference with these people is that they recognize an inspiration for its utility as well as everything else. They're able to choose it and then to burrow into it, I think. I mean, if we're talking about inspirations as really ideas, and almost all of the works that I talk about in the book, there were a lot of stumbles, missteps, the inspiration came from a dream, and then they maybe went down a different path, and then that brought them to a different path. And inspiration was constantly, maybe I'm not using the word inspiration in the way that you're thinking about it, but I'm thinking about it just in terms of the word idea. The things that occurred to them are constantly, there's a kind of firing thing happening, and some of them pan out and some of them don't, and there's just a fusillade almost of things firing at them. It's almost like a video game, and they are dodging them or they're seizing them. So much of art making is about recognizing what is going to work for you, and it's also about following rabbit holes, and it's also about dead ends. The miracle of all of this is how these people can find their way to the end through all of that.
We'll return to the conversation after this quick break. Hey, you've got ideas. Now all you need is a website to make them real. Well, here's good news. Bluehost makes it super easy. I've used them many, many times, and I love them. It's the all-in-one platform for building and hosting websites. You can save time on design and use AI to build a custom WordPress site within minutes. No coding skills needed, just your ideas. Bluehost also has tools to help you optimize and scale your website's growth, all in one place. Things like blogging, SEO, social posting, email campaigns, and so much more. It's all built into the platform, which makes it super easy. And when you upgrade to Bluehost Cloud, you can start managing multiple sites and domains. Pretty great if you're working with a lot of clients. Not only that, you can also get 100% uptime, enhanced security, and priority 24/7 support to keep you online no matter what. That means no crashing from heavy traffic. Build your brand, build your following, build your website. Build it with Bluehost. Go to bluehost.com and start building your dream website today. As a Design Better listener, we have another podcast that we think you'll enjoy. Adobe's In the Making, hosted by Teresa Au, takes an honest look at the challenges and rewards of being part of the creator economy. Building a business around your creative pursuits, it ain't easy. Wouldn't it be great to learn from those who have done this before? That's what this show is all about. The show helps you discover creative, intriguing people making a living in the creator economy and gives inspiration no matter what you do. The show is full of actionable takeaways that you can apply to your creative practice and small business. Teresa has a really warm, engaging host style, plus her vulnerability makes for great conversations. There's literally laughter and tears in the show. I loved her recent episode with my pal Tina Roth Eisenberg. She's the founder of Creative Mornings. She shares her backstory and how creating community is key to everything she does creatively. Check out In the Making from Adobe to learn more about how to build a creative career and a creative life. Subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And now, back to the show.
On the subject of ideas, some of your subjects, I'm thinking of Roz Chast here, are very deliberate about the way they collect ideas. So Roz has this like a shoebox full of idea germs, which are just little things, scribbled on a scrap of paper. And then she also has idea scraps, which are maybe longer things. So maybe talk a little bit about her collections and other ones that you ran into across this project.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of notebooks, which I loved in this collection. Roz's were particularly funny because they're just kind of notions that she gets as she's looking at a subway sign or walking down the street, or she has some weird two-word juxtaposition that she thinks are funny, and then she throws them in a box, and then she doesn't even understand them necessarily when she comes back to the box, but sometimes she does, and sometimes it sparks something later. And there's a drag artist, really a performance artist named Dina Martina, that's also in the book, that also has this kind of notebook of crazy associations. The artist's name is Grady West. He just accumulates without having any idea about whether it's going to be of use to him, and goes back to it. And if it reignites, then it becomes a useful thing. But there's a kind of free associative aspect to almost everybody's process here. There is a moment in which they just simply allow themselves to let stuff in, even if it is illogical or even if it does not yet make sense to them. And then a later part of the process, they begin to create a strategy around it.
There's a great line to that point in the book. It was Jody Williams and Rita Sodi.
Mm-hmm.
There's like all these principles that they're listing. And number 3, which is the best of them all, said, allow yourself not to know what you're doing.
Yeah. And really, so many, I could have ended every single chapter. I mean, the first chapter, which is Kara Walker, the artist, she ends her chapter with, every time I start, I realize I don't know what I'm doing, which of course is not exactly true. It's a feeling that they all have. And I could have ended every single chapter that way because they all feel that way. And I think that's what makes them good, is that they are in a state of wanting to learn. That openness to learning, that openness to trying new things, to, in essence, starting over, is what gives their work so much freshness. But of course, it's not really starting over because there's this accumulation over a lifetime of knowledge and experience and information and craft that helps them in their pursuit.
So there's some artists who are discovering, like Kara Walker, but then there are some who have like a very specific direction and they have an argument to make, like David Simon. I love that you included David Simon in this because he's such an interesting thinker. Listeners who don't know David Simon, he is the magic behind The Wire, which is, many call the best TV ever created. That first season, they spent all this time and energy building characters and stories and kind of an infrastructure of what this was going to be. You get to the second season, and you're like, wait a second, am I tuned into the right program here, or is this something totally different? So that's a different type of creativity where we've got some specific goal that we're trying to convey here. Can you talk about how that creative process is different?
Yeah, I'm not sure really it is that different because it's an instinct. I mean, he started The Wire basically, which was it was a sort of cops and robbers show. And he had drug dealers on the one side and he had the sort of cops and the police establishment on the other side. And he felt that what he'd created was too limited. And so what he really wanted to do was something much broader, bigger, an evaluation of systems where the sort of pathology of the drug trade and its prosecution comes from, has to do with systems about civic government and about class. And so he was in a group that disagreed with him violently. And he said, no, we're going to wrench this show away from the location where this drug ring was operating. And we're going to go and talk about work. And so we're going to go to the ports because the ports no longer had a kind of functioning employment model. And we're going to kind of blow it up. And they were all pissed off, all his colleagues, but he persevered and he made the show he wanted to do. But, I think that the key point is that all of the artists, they kind of get an idea. That idea is very important. They kind of get the thing and they think they know what they want to do. And for the most part, that trips them up over and over and over again because they learn the limits of their initial idea. And it's their openness to changing and shifting that makes the thing work. I mean, some of these things, the essence of it happened on first try. There's a painter in there named Gerald Lavelle who's doing a self-portrait, and the core to the portrait is his depiction of his own eyes. And that happened within the first 5 minutes of him making the painting. But then creating the painting around it and struggling through what the rest of the painting would be was the work. And almost everyone, they have an instinct, they have a kind of idea, they have a hypothesis, let's call it that. And the process is testing the hypothesis over and over and over again.
One of the subjects that you talk a bit about with Ira Glass's interview is this idea of taste and the gap between your capabilities and your taste. So at a younger point in your career, you may have developed a good aesthetic, a good sense of taste, but there's a gap between what you can execute on and what your vision is. And Aaron wrote about this recently. Give a quick plug for our newsletter. But we're curious, is there other examples of that you encountered where folks either earlier in their career didn't quite yet have the developed talent or the resources to execute on their vision and the taste that they had?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of everywhere, although it's kind of the prequel to the book, because by the time I'm talking to them and the case studies of the making of these accomplished works, their capabilities have caught up to their dreams. But I did love it when Ira Glass said that to me. It was such a valuable insight for me, which is that is the moment that most people give up. They have a dream. They don't yet have the skills to execute that dream. That is so frustrating that most people, I think, abandon it. And for the people in this book, it was the perseverance through that frustration that enabled them eventually to be so accomplished.
Are there common threads or maybe even like stark differences between all these different disciplines, writers, filmmakers, painters? I mean, there's just so many different types of disciplines represented in your book.
In particular, they're all different, and not just between and among genres, but between and among projects. Every project has its own path. However, there are enough commonalities to make my book have some coherence, I hope, which is to say that there is this, what I think of as the three-part process: imagination, which we've talked about, and then ending with shaping. But there's this vast arena in between, which I call judging. It's also editing. It's also strategy. It's also like making sense. It's in some ways the intellectual side, the planning side of making the thing. And that's true whether you're working on a novel or a poem or a painting or a hamburger, to go back to Jody Williams and Rita Sodi. They don't call it a hamburger, but in any case, it's a piece of chopped meat. And that's kind of all the same. It's like you get an idea, the idea catches fire or it doesn't. Then you have a sort of beautiful mess, and then you judge what's in the mess, and you begin to work out a plan, a blueprint. That's really what all of these artifacts in the book were. They were blueprints. And then comes the craft side, the shaping, where you actually, if you're good at this, if you're George Saunders and you can write sentences that have the power that his do, or Sofia Coppola, or any of the artists in the book who have genuine capabilities, skills that they've honed over a long period of time, or maybe were born with. But in between this strategy aspect of it, this figuring out how to make it the thing that they want to make, and that process is long. It's not like 1 minute. It's really the essence of the work. That's common through all of them. Also, there's a certain kind of person, whether they're a novelist or a painter or a poet, who tends to be good at this. And they're people who have an enormous amount of patience. They have a kind of superhuman persistence and drive to create, no matter how frustrating or thwarting the experience seems to be. Ultimately, they have faith. They think they can do it. The path is such that there's so many reasons to give up. There's so many reasons to stop making the thing. It's just full of landmines. And it's that person who can somehow get to the end because of these things, because of their faith, because of their tolerance for tedium, because of their will and drive. Those are the artists in my book, no matter what they're making.
Let's talk about artifacts a little bit more. And your book is filled with wonderful artifacts, sketches and doodles and notebooks. And one that stood out to me from the very beginning of the book was a sketch by Frank Gehry, which precluded his work on the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. It was very much this very loose doodle, but it somehow did capture some of the essence of what eventually became the building. So maybe talk to us about why you're drawn to these artifacts and what you, through the different disciplines and working with them.
That's a crazy one, isn't it? I mean, it's just, it starts the book because I was looking at it. I was in Bilbao itself. I was in the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao itself. And, as you do, you go to a gift shop and you're just like decompressing from the art you've seen in the thing. And your mind is kind of in a sort of goofy, open and distracted state. And I opened the book and I love them because I love squiggles and I love drawings and I love the unmediated aspect of them. I love to draw myself. And so I'm just kind of drawn, no pun intended, drawn to that. And I'm flipping the book and I get to that sketch. And then the sketch looks so much like the building that I am now in. And the building, which is famous for its sort of startling originality. I mean, we're now used to what a Gehry building looks like, but we weren't at the time that building was built. It was a completely new idea. And to see it and then to look at the walls around me, I say in the book, it was like almost like a Pixar short where the thing just took life of its own. And it became this little cartoon where the drawing sprung to life and became the building that I'm looking at. It was like, So this is how it can happen. And the book begins with the squiggle and then the picture of the museum at that same angle. And it's just shocking. This thing would just enter into his head without a plan, really. It's just how his mind worked. It was just his imagination at work. And it would have such a strong relationship to the thing that he eventually built. I've always loved these artifacts. I love them because I'm interested in narrative, and they're often forensic, and you can see in it the path that someone took to making the thing, which I love. You can see their kind of emotional state as the book's cover is these two giant X's off a page that Marcel Proust was writing. The emotion, the vigor, the erasure in that case really appealed to me. I feel these artifacts are kind of nosy. They're like where you're not supposed to have seen. They're kind of like journals or letters. They're private. That I find really appealing. But also I just, in the end, they feel animate with anticipation. They feel like you're seeing the artist mid-thought. And that just feels very powerful to me.
What were the surprises or revelations as you talk to all these different artists, possibly about their process, possibly just about the way they see the world? Were you ever taken off guard? Like, wow, I totally didn't see that one coming.
The more I talk to people, the less I was startled by it. I'm very romantic about art making, and I did come to the thing with a kind of naive idea that artists were kind of thunderstruck geniuses. And it began as a project of envy and awe, really. And then as I began to talk to people and realized that their stumbles and struggles were just the same as mine, it was shocking to me. But then there are little shocks all over the place. Kara Walker, who made this great work called A Subtlety, or The Marvelous Sugar Baby, which was a giant sphinx made of sugar that was built in an abandoned sugar factory. It's such a powerful work of art. And she figured out how to do it with the use of a PowerPoint. It was so logical and in some ways runs so counter to all the ideas I have about how an artist works. I talked to this documentary filmmaker named Andrew Jarecki, and he made this movie I think is remarkable called Capturing the Friedmans, which began as a movie about party clowns and turned into a movie about child abuse. And it's a remarkable path, how it got from one thing to another. He had no experience or very little experience as a movie maker. And it was a process of simply discovering that the clown he was talking to had a dark secret in his family, that his father and his brother had been charged with raping a bunch of boys in the basement of their family home, which Andrew Jarecki just intuitively felt didn't seem true, but it seemed interesting enough to him. And in fact, it wasn't true. And that's what the movie demonstrates beautifully. But also what Andrew saw, even with his lack of experience, was that there was an incredible film to be made about a family torn apart by this kind of tragedy. And that was a shock. Louise Gluck, the poet, Nobel Prize winning poet who died last year, she made this beautiful poem called Song because she had a dream in which a line came to her, and she woke up and she wrote down the line. And for me, the line was relatively ordinary. But for her, the line just unlocked an entire poem eventually. That kind of thing was absolutely riveting to me, however kind of small in a sense that revelation was. Tony Kushner, Angels in America, which has one of the most iconic theatrical moments, which is when an angel crashes through the ceiling in Angels in America and crashes through the ceiling to reveal herself to the lead character who has AIDS and is having hallucinations. It's such an incredible moment in American theater. And it came to him in a dream too. He saw this thing. So all the ways in which these things happen were surprising to me. But in the end, what I guess I realized is that surprise is actually part of the process, that strange things happen. And knowing how to harness those strange things is kind of the key to the whole thing.
There's a kind of a truism in art and creativity that to make good work, you have to make a lot of work. You have to create a lot of things. And I think in a previous episode, we talked about Picasso, and he's created something in his career, like 150,000 different pieces of various mediums.
But a lot of them are great.
He had a pretty good ratio working for him. But maybe talk to a little bit about, did you make any discoveries about the volume of work that people created in their career?
It's not the same from artist to artist. Some artists create a lot of stuff that they throw away, and other artists kind of save up. There's not any one particular path in that regard. But I do think it's just simply true that a lot of the act of making art is practice. And a lot of the act is, as I've been saying, is failing. You have to make mistakes. You have to risk. If you don't risk, you don't gain. And so in order to do that, people make stuff over and over and over and over again. I've been, as a kind of frustrated painter, I've been spending the summer in order to kind of practice. I just kind of make a painting a day. I do portraits and figures, and I'm just like, every day I have a new kind of task for myself, a new assignment. All right, let me try this today. Let me try that today. And then as they go along, it's like, well, this worked kind of over here in this corner, and can I steal that and put it in here? And the volume for me is extremely helpful. I mean, there's this recurring sort of cliche in creativity, but it's also true that this reference to vomiting, that you have to vomit in order to eventually make something. There's a great, Amy Silman has a great little illustration or drawing of a vomiter, which I gave prominence to because it just seemed so crucial to the whole business. And so, yeah, the vomit is voluminous. So in that sense, it's crucial.
How did the process of making this book change your work, your painting, your own creative endeavors?
And my frustration was always that as a painter, let's just say, I couldn't stand the things I was making. I was just so infuriated, almost disgusted by the work I was making. But I really did enjoy the making of it. I was kind of bored with the outcome, but never bored with the making. And I began to ask all these artists. I'm a writer also, so that I'm trying to create stories, and I'm trying to create a kind of dramatic finish to each of these stories in which they make this wonderful work, and they're thrilled, and they have this sense of catharsis and breakthrough and euphoria. Nobody gave me that. Nobody. Now, obviously, they were being humble about the thing that they made, et cetera, but I came to appreciate that that was not the point. That they didn't feel that. They felt, yeah, good, that's nice. Things get recognized. They felt, yeah, good, that's nice. But the next day they were at work doing it again, and that what they were in it for was the making. What they were in it for was all the stuff that I was dismissing that I enjoyed. So I guess the answer to your question really is that I began to embrace the making, and I won't pretend that I don't care what the thing looks like in the end, but I began to take more seriously the interest and absorption and pleasure I had in the making, and that maybe that was enough.
Adam, what right now, and there's a lot of inspiring stuff throughout your book, but we're also curious, is there anything that's either in the book or outside of it that's particularly inspiring you right now? And that could be TV show, novel, painting, podcast, anything.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hyper alert to anything that gives me some crazy little idea. I'm kind of in this visual art thing. So there's a used bookstore around here in Provincetown called Tim's Used Books. And they have like this just pile of art books that they don't organize in any way. And it's just a giant mound of stuff. And I go in there maybe every 2 or 3 weeks, and I just kind of make my way through the pile. And I'll always find some artist I never heard of. And the books are, $8. And I bring it home, and I will gain so much excitement. I mean, I look at something, it's kind of a bad thing for me because I look at a work I love and I kind of want to imitate it. I want to do it. My fantasy life is such that if I look at it hard enough, I'll make it. So it's not necessarily healthy, but it is also thrilling. And for that moment, I have made it. Just in particular, there's just this Egon Schiele book that I got 2 days ago that I find myself a little obsessed over at the moment. One of the gazillion. I mean, I don't even pay attention to what book it is because it all has the same work in it, but it re-excites me every time.
Egon Schiele is haunting. It's hard to escape the gravity of him.
Yeah.
Adam Moss is great conversations, great book. The book is The Work of Art, How Something Comes from Nothing. Presumably, listeners can find this wherever they get books.
Such a pleasure to talk to you guys. Thank you.
This episode was produced by Eli Woolery and me, Aaron Walter, with engineering and production support from Brian Paik of Pacific Audio. If you found this episode useful, we hope that you'll leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to finer shows. Or simply drop a link to the show in your team's Slack channel, designbetterpodcast.com. It'll really help others discover the show. Until next time.